Greetings, fellow travelers. Welcome to the 44th level of the RPG Cave. I'm one of your hosts, Ryan Turford, the level 99 human RPG. I'm only laughing because I'm pointing to myself, but no one can currently see me right now. And I'm joined, as always, by the level 99 elf medic, Mr. Garret Bland. Garret, how are you doing on this lovely, Monday evening? You're in cyberspace at the moment, apparently.
I am. I'm in the cyberspace. I got the background going. I know it's kind of bad without a green screen. My hands are invisible.
Yeah.
And it looks like you turned on your invisible cloak skill over there, Ryan.
Well,
I just can't see you at all.
I mean, I was adventuring in the dungeon, Garret, and I came across a cloak of invisibility. I'm like, maybe I'll try this on. But I found out too late, though, that it's a cursed.
Yes.
It's a cursed cloak. So
it's a cursed cloak.
So I can't actually take it off, unfortunately. So no one can actually see me right now. Of course, Sean points out in the chat a good start to our night this
we got to
evening.
keep the bed going, man. All right.
Actually, for full transparency, it's just my computer unfortunately cannot keep up with the load of having, both of us on screen at the same time, apparently, because it's a computer from 5 years ago. But enough about all of that. We're live right here at youtube.com/carpoolgaming, which is new for us, Garret, because we actually did this during Carpool Gaming Day on Friday.
Mm-hmm.
We did a live episode there, but then we're live again this week. And in fact, going forward, Garret, the RPG Cave is going to be a live show. Thanks to everyone's support over on Patreon, over at patreon.com/carpoolgaming. So huge thanks to everyone for, supporting us both on Carpool Gaming Day and then ever since then as well. Because, we've had just a lot of great feedback from the community since then, as well as some new patrons. So things have been awesome. And it was a rousing success. So because of that, this show will be live going forward. So you can check out the live version if you're listening on audio feeds every Monday night at 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on youtube.com/carpoolgaming. But as well, if you want to support the show, there's a number of awesome ways to do that. Number one, if you like what we do and you want to support us, subscribe to us on your podcast feed of choice. We're on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, pretty much all the places you find podcasts. So make sure to hit that subscribe button. Likewise, if you're watching us on YouTube during this live stream, or if you're watching the VOD later, make sure to hit that subscribe button, like this video, comment below, tell us whether or not you prefer action RPGs or turn-based RPGs, because that's our topic tonight. So let us know about that in the chat below or in the comments below. And then, of course, ding, ding, ding. Ring that bell for those notifications to be notified about all of our newest videos over here at Carpool Gaming. Because guess what, folks? There's going to be a lot of videos going forward, so please be excited. And then, last but not least, if you want early access to this and all of our shows, head on over to Patreon, patreon.com/carpoolgaming. Right now, currently, we have some cool perks, including if you join at the $50 level, which is our ultimate producer tier, we have a limited edition Founders t-shirt that is part of that perk right now. So if you want to get your hands on that t-shirt before it goes away forever, you got to join up. You got to become part of the crew. And then also, I lied. One last thing. We have a merch store, Garret. We talked about it last week on the show as well. There's an RPG Cave shirt. It's awesome. Mm-hmm. It's designed by Consultato. The link is in the show notes as well. Or again, if you're watching on the live stream, I have the link in the description of this live stream as well. All right, Garret, without further ado, it's time to read from the secret text, and just imagine in your mind's eye that I'm, pulling the scroll apart, Garret, to read it. That's what's going on right now. So
yeah, that's what you're doing right now. Okay, cool. Sounds good.
So I've talked an awful lot, Garret, so I'm going to give you a chance to talk here. What is our grand topic tonight? Because you came up with this amazing idea for a show this evening, and I want to give you the floor on this one, my friend.
Sure. We wanted to take a spin on a couple of genres in the RPG games universe, and we are breaking into two broad categories as the action RPGs and the turn-based RPGs. And what me and Ryan did, we called heads or tails, and first choice is one or the other. We're going to argue against each other what is better, the action RPGs or the turn-based RPGs. But more importantly, we're just going to have a fruitful discussion of the differences, similarities, and call out our favorite games from the genre we chose and see which one is better, actually,
Because we all know.
Let's see how this goes.
Because we're representing opposite sides. A lot of times, usually Garret and I are on the same page with this show. But tonight, we're butting heads, Garret. Get excited. Because Garret is representing the side of action RPGs. Garret won the coin flip and he chose action RPGs. I will remind everyone of that. Whereas I ended up with turn-based RPGs, which honestly, if I would have won the coin flip, that's what I would have picked anyways. Because, I mean,
Yes,
you probably know me from listening to the show, especially because I'm more of the old school gamer of the two of us. I'm probably more likely to, be in the turn-based RPG camp than, everyone else. So it makes perfect sense. So we're going to go through this as well. We also got some great feedback from the community because we also asked the community, the Carpool Gaming community, what their preferences were. And we'll get to those a little bit later in the show. Likewise, if you're watching the live broadcast and you want to interact with us as well, you can let us know anytime throughout this show. And then when I get to the community picks, we'll read off some of your suggestions in the chat as well. So without further ado, Garrett, I think it's time to get into this.
Yes.
And first of all, this is the first time we've done a debate like this on the show. Naturally, what I'm going to suggest is we kind of go back and forth with like one game apiece, kind of like what we do on a lot of our other shows when we have like lists and stuff like that put together. And then we'll kind of present arguments back and forth as we go through it. So because you won the coin flip, Garrett, just like in, football, you have the right to choose to go first or second.
I will go first. I will try to put out strong for the action RPGs for sure.
All right. But where do you want to start first with action RPGs? Give me your argument for action RPGs, Garrett.
Well, okay, so I did feel like I chose the underdog, but for good reason. Okay, I think the action RPGs, even though the element itself of action games per se can be kind of overused in a lot of other games. You see a lot of RPG elements getting into action games now more presently. They've been around for a very long time, ever since, the series that I'm about to start with. And we actually mentioned in the previous RPG Cave, the Yeast series, the Yeast series and all of them over there have been going on for a very long time. Action RPGs are not just a current, kind of novelty per se in the current RPG world. It's been going around for a long time, Ryan. It's been going on since the turn-based games. So I just want to shout it out that, action RPGs, they've been around for a very long time, and they've been very well engaged comparatively to the turn-based games, and the interactivity of action games. You go into it in these games and you just mash those buttons and those levels go up and there's a story there, as same as turn-based games. Let me tell you, Yeast games, they're super fun, Ryan. Yeah. That's my first punch out is these classic games. I'm gonna go to the forefront later. I got some heavy hitters, for the present action RPGs. Mm-hmm. I just want to start out with a little bit of the classic here of the Yeast series. So what do you think?
So it's funny you say that you're just going to start ramping up, Garrett, because I feel like I've got a stacked list of punches to the gut going on here. So sure, you can start off slow if you want, but the Yeast series, I have to agree. I mean, the Yeast series is actually pretty awesome. There are a lot of great games in that series, and it's really fun. I mean, the downside to those games is I just feel like playing a Yeast game is not as fulfilling combat-wise as like a fast action game or a Souls-like game or something like that. Like something that's, really like action combat focused. And I know we're going to get there with some of your later picks, but at least with that series, that's maybe its undoing versus a lot of my turn-based list where it's like, it's going to be very easy to be like, oh yeah, that's like one of the top, turn-based games around. And it makes perfect sense. And it's fun from both a combat perspective and great from a story perspective. Whereas Ease, I think it falls a little bit flat when it comes to the combat versus the story. I think the stories are great in those games. And I think the combat's fun, but it's not like I'm not going out of my way for the combat in that game, if that makes any sense.
I agree with you on that. I just wanted to pull out a classic series like, hey, action games, they've been around for a long time. They're not just a current, like go-to type of RPG genre. It's like Yeast series has been around, so action RPGs has its legacy since like the late 80s. So there you go.
Nice. Well, that's a good start to this debate here, Garrett. But I'm gonna go in the opposite direction here, and I did something a little bit different with my list. I didn't go from like classical series to modern series or vice versa. What I decided to do with my list is kind of give you like the breadth of how the turn-based genre can be used, because the one thing about turn-based RPGs is that I think it works a lot better than action RPGs is that they can evolve in a bunch of different ways that are really refreshing, that can almost, you can slot like turn-based RPGs in a bunch of different genres even. So my 5 games that I'm going to go through kind of represent that, where I've got the most like classic of classic turn-based RPGs, but it's also a modern RPG in Persona 5, Garrett, because Persona 5 on our thumbnail, socking to the face right there just to start. Persona 5, of course, amazing game. You know it from us. We've talked about it on the podcast many times. But the reason I want to start with Persona 5 is because it's essentially what I consider the modern day equivalent of like the peak of like the standard turn-based RPG game design, essentially, where the gameplay in Persona 5 isn't really much different than even like going back and playing, Final Fantasy 6 or something like that, other than of course using your personas. But for the most part, the combat itself, very similar to old school games that I remember playing on the Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis, but with a modern take to it. For example, the ability to sneak up on enemies and surprise attack them that way, because there's a lot of stealth mechanics in kind of the open world environment that play into the turn-based system, to the way, guns work their way into the equation, as well as the elemental system, because it's all about, exploiting your enemy's weakness and then taking advantage of it and going in with the all-out attacks with your party members. I just think Persona 5 is just the prime example. It like in this slot, I had either this or Dragon Quest 11, but I'm just much more familiar with Persona 5, and I think Persona 5 is a better example of this, and a good baseline to start with for where the turn-based genre can definitely go for turn-based RPGs. So Persona 5 is my first heavy hitter, Garrett. We both know it's amazing. We both know it's a masterpiece of a game, whether you're playing the base game or Royal. But Garrett, what's your rebuttal to my claims to Persona 5?
Well, I love Persona 5. Don't get me wrong. It's a great game. And I remember playing it and finishing it in 2017. Granted, I have not played the Royal version, which I really would like to do sometime. Mm-hmm. I don't know. But do I have 120, 150 hours to spare? I don't know. That's a very long time. I felt like, even though Persona 5 was a very good experience, and I agree with you on all your points, the pacing can be, it's good for like the first 75% of the game, and then I don't know about you, Ryan, but I felt it dragged on and on. And I'm glad you didn't say Dragon Quest 11, because I heard that game.
I was going to say, if you want a game that drags, it's Dragon Quest 11, Garrett.
For sure, man, for sure. And, that's not like any indicative of like a turn-based game. Action games action RPGs could be long as well, but it's just like maybe with the turn-based plus the story, the pacing can be, I feel like, turn-based games can be a little bit chopped up. Just like, you're going into a level, you're going into a dungeon. I know you're strategizing and everything, going in and out with all these elements, but it's still kind of breaking the game. It's like, all right, you're going into a battle now. And it's like, okay, sounds good. I'll pause for a second. And I think, for you and I think it's fun. But I think a lot, like the main audience, even the non-RPGs people, it's like they go to an action RPG. It's like, oh yeah, this is going to be, it's going to be interactive. It's going to be super fun. It's going to have a flow to it. If it's good, if it's a good action RPG. So that's my rebuttal for Persona 5 is the pacing.
Now,
it can be a little bit slow.
See, here's the thing, Garrett, and here's my kind of reply to your rebuttal about Persona 5, is that I don't think the pace of the game's problem has to do with it being a turn-based RPG, because I feel like that's the type of game, because of the way the story and the elements outside of the combat are concerned, even if it was an action RPG, I feel like the pacing would just be as bad. Like regardless of whether or not, like if you took it out of it, and if it was like Persona 5 Strikers, for example, because if you want to talk about a game that drags, I think Persona 5 Strikers also falls into that camp. And that's a full action RPG, Garrett, right? So
it is.
That's why, like, I feel like even though I understand your concerns with the pacing with Persona 5, But I don't think that, because it's a turn, it doesn't apply in this situation because it doesn't, it's not because it's a turn-based RPG that's a problem. Because I think the combat in that game actually moves at a really fast pace for a turn-based game.
Mm-hmm.
So
for a turn-based game.
Yeah, so I actually think it's pretty snappy when it comes to that. It's just a lot of the story elements, for sure. I definitely agree with you on some of that stuff. Because, again...
dragged on.
And to be fair, it's kind of hard for any game that's 100 hours long to not do that, at least at some point. But Persona 5 is definitely up there. But Dragon Quest definitely much worse, which is, again, why I didn't pick this for this. But, Garrett, give me your next game. What's your next example to kind of prove the superiority of action RPGs?
All right. You brought the heavy hitter of Persona 5. I'm bringing the heavy hitters of the Western RPGs, mainly circling around the Bethesda games. You know it, Ryan. These action RPGs are so good. And what they bring out, I think, other than the action RPG-ness of it, I know we're going to get there, is that the stories that they tell and the flows of in and out of the environment. I think that's why it works so well, is because they go into, quests and characters, and like they bring up a lot of relationships, a lot of different storylines. Exploration is kind of like the biggest thing in their minds when you're going into these games. And the action RPG-ness of it may not be the best in terms of combat. Let's say with the Skyrim or maybe even Witcher, there's a lot of, negative comments about that. But like, it's just a transition from going into town and then going out into the world and figuring it out. Mm-hmm. And with a turn-based game, I'm not too sure you can bring these games into a turn-based world. You could try, but I think because they chose an action RPG, and even with like Fallout series, is they got the VAT system to strategize a little bit, so they're taking a little bit of the book from the turn-based game to make it a little bit more interesting. I think what really shines here is the story-driven of these games, and then transitioning into the action combat it's just seamless, going from in and out. It makes it very explorative, and that's why I'm very, very into these Bethesda games, actually. So, Ryan, what do you think about my angle of Bethesda Western RPGs, the Skyrims, the Fallouts? What do you think?
So I definitely think that you're onto something there, Garrett, as far as talking about the pace of the game with action RPGs like Skyrim or Fallout or just any other Bethesda RPG, where essentially, you don't have to wait for, a load screen or the screen to contort sideways like it does in Final Fantasy VII whenever you run into a battle. Like, you're just instantly in the battle and you're instantly fighting the enemies, essentially, like in the world that you're in. And I mean, there are examples that I'm going to have actually on my list of turn-based RPGs that actually do the same thing. But definitely, that's definitely a big angle that action RPGs have, where essentially you can have a world populated with enemies that you just fight as you explore all of the open worlds. So definitely, I think you brought the heavy hitter there. And that's definitely a serious blow against us on the turn-based side. But at the same time, I personally kind of like the more kind of relaxed pace. Because I'm an old man, Garrett. I don't know if you knew this. The relaxed pace of going around at your own peril and just having fun with it. Just having fun with it. You're like not worrying about having to run into an enemy or having to fight an enemy right away the second he sees you or something like that. Even if random battles happen every 5 feet or whatever that you walk in the environment, it doesn't matter. I kind of like that, but we'll see about that. But you bring up some good points with the Bethesda games. In fact, I was very tempted to have Console Kato put the Skyrim dude, the Dragonborn guy. I mean, we call him the Dragonborn guy because you can make any character you want in Skyrim, but the Dragonborn guy on the thumbnail. But I decided to go in a different direction, which I'm sure you probably will with your list a little bit later. But anyways, as for me, I want to talk about how modern games also take the Persona 5 formula and really improve it in an interesting way. And the example I actually brought up for this one, which you might actually find a little bit interesting, Garrett, because I know you've played this game before. Bravely Default is the next game I'm about to talk about, because what I love about a game like Bravely Default is it basically takes the same formula I just talked about with Persona 5, which is kind of like the baseline for turn-based RPGs. But what it does really well, not only giving you kind of like a big open areas to explore with these beautiful like hand-drawn graphics that you probably wouldn't be able to get away with a lot of times with an action RPG. Let's be real, because you've got these 3D visuals. I mean, no one wants to play a game in 3D, right, Garrett? You want to play a game in 2D because 2D is where it's at, right? But Bravely Default, what I like about the combat in particular is it really allows you to have this like really nice like push and pull of like a risk reward system in its combat, and it allows you to have a lot of unique like player choices that you would never have really in a turn-based game, because you do have some risk reward scenarios in an action RPG, but for the most part there's nothing like kind of the Brave and the default system in Bravely Default, where essentially you can use up extra moves to like do like 8 or 9 attacks stacked on top of each other with 1 or 2 characters, but then kind of risk yourself to an opening, versus again being a little more defensive and kind of charging up some of those moves. Because again, you can be a little more aggressive in, you know, a game like Skyrim or a game like Witcher, but it doesn't feel the same. It doesn't feel evolved in the same way that I feel like Bravely Default kind of evolved turn-based combat in a nice little modern way. So again, it holds up the same tenets of older games, or even a game like Persona 5, which is more of the standard formula, while also going in like twisting that in like an interesting new direction, which is pretty cool. So I think that's a good example of where I wanted to go with this next, Garrett. I know it's not as much of a heavy hitter as Persona 5. I'm sorry, right. I couldn't go there. In fact, it's probably like the lowest hitter probably on the rest of my list.
50 steps back or something, but right. I applaud you on the Bravely Default. I did enjoy of what I played of that game, and I agree with you. The Brave and Default system has a cool twist to it, so I'll give you that. The grinding in that game, man.
Yeah, I mean the last half of that game, it's very silly. But again, same thing that I talked about with Persona 5. Like it would have that same problem because it's a story-based problem, whether it was an action RPG or not. So that's why I kind of factored that out of this discussion in a lot of ways.
Yeah, sounds good. I mean, just my major rebuttal with, you know, Bravely Default. I've played a good chunk amount of that game, but I felt the repetitiveness very fast with that one. I played maybe like 20 or 30 hours of that game, so not too long. I know the story gets much better and go throughout the game, but I heard like similar to Dragon Quest XI, Bravely Default at the end, you just gotta grind, and basically in order to get to the end. And I don't know, you gotta have patience for that, or listen to a podcast like the RPG Cave and just go at it.
I like the way you think, Garrett. I mean, yeah, it's a good podcast game. In fact, that's one of the things I like about turn-based games in particular. So a lot of them are actually like really good podcast games, or games that if you're watching YouTube or other things like that, like they're nice things to play on the couch on like a Retroid Pocket or a Nintendo Switch, maybe while you know you're watching TV or something like that as well. Whereas I think it's tougher to do with something like that with an action RPG, because I think it requires a little bit more of your focus because everything's so real time versus, you know, turn-based. It's at your own pace essentially, unless you've got like the active time battle system from the Final Fantasy games working against you, I guess. But anyways, Garrett, nice. what's your third game? Where do you want to go transition to next?
All right, so here's my angle here for action RPGs. Point number 3. It's just one word, guys. Co-op. Co-op can be very essential in certain action RPGs, and I'll pull in a couple examples here. One, the Diablo series. You know, you're going in with your friends, and you're just having a good time. Diablo, I don't know if anyone else has played out there. I played it so much as single player and as multiplayer, Diablo 3 on the PlayStation. And what I really enjoyed about playing it co-op is just talking, having a good time with my friends, and just smashing monsters left and right. Is a isometric dungeon crawler where you just build your character up. You got go throughout the monsters, and then you level up, and then you level up your skills, and so on and so forth, and you're just having a good time. And I feel like that puts in a leg up with the action RPGs. compared to the turn-based is that you can have a good time with your friends and just play together. Other than that, I know the new action RPG from Drinkbox Studios, Nobody Saves the World. That is a couch co-op game as well. And that is a dungeon crawler as well. And there's just many other examples of action RPGs that you can have someone come in as a co-op, as a playmate to get together, have a good time. I don't think turn-based games have that same enjoyment. I'm sure you can pass the controller. I know you've probably had memories of that, but you cannot play most of the turn-based games simultaneously. So what do you think about that, Ryan?
Yeah, you definitely hit the nail on the head with that one, Garrett, because co-op is definitely something that, the turn-based games are kind of lacking. I mean, there's just not really a great way to really do that unless it's like a multiplayer game where you're battling against each other. Because there are battle modes in some RPGs. Like the most famous example is like when we talked about Advance Wars, for example, or Fire Emblem. Yeah. Because like if you play Fire Emblem Fates, for example, you can invade enemies' bases and you can play against your friends that way. But there's no co-op. You can't play Fire Emblem Fates co-op together and go on missions and stuff like that. So that makes a lot of sense, Garrett. And that one's definitely tough for me to kind of, come back against anyways. Because, but at the same time, I mean, I personally just like playing games by myself more than playing co-op. So on the other side of the coin, the nice thing about turn-based games is I can always rely on their ability for me to be able to play them by myself and not have to worry about running into an issue where the game is not balanced correctly for one player, which does happen from time to time. And I've talked about it on the show before with the Borderlands series. As much as I am interested in those games, I always find that that's a serious problem with the older Borderlands games. Not with Tiny Tina, which just came out, because I've been talking about that one on the Xbox Drive, where I think that they've kind of perfected that formula, and I don't feel it has that same problem. But going back and playing, the original Borderlands and getting 10 hours in and finding that I can't play that game by myself because it's meant for co-op and I don't have a co-op partner to play with, it becomes kind of like a hindrance to action RPGs, I find, if not balanced correctly. And there are some examples of that as well. But that's a good point. I'm glad that you actually thought about co-op, Garrett, because I think that's an interesting example. So for me, where I want to transition to next is actually an interesting direction, because this is kind of working its way into, turn-based RPGs that can be a bunch of different genres. Because we talked about kind of like, the traditional turn-based RPG and then what that's like. But then I want to bring in an RPG genre that doesn't actually exist very well anyways in the action RPG space, Garrett, and that is survival horror games, because I'm someone who loves survival horror games. I love Resident Evil, for example. It's one of my all-time favorite gaming series, and I've talked about this one on the show before too, but my next example is Parasite Eve from Square Enix. Parasite Eve is a survival horror game that's a turn-based RPG. So you get equipment, you get bullets along the way as you're exploring, these creepy spaces as it goes through, and you kind of have to conserve your ammo a bit, because if you use too much of your ammo in combat, then you'll run out of ammo and you're basically gonna die very, very quickly, essentially, because you'll run out of resources. Because again, it's meant to essentially take the idea that you had in a game like Resident Evil, where you have a finite amount of resources that ratchet up the tension in that game, and then mix it with a turn-based system that's similar to Final Fantasy. So I love the way that it plays on the different genres. And again, as far as action RPGs are concerned, when you look at survival horror games, there's not much that's good, if anything, because you've got stuff like Zombie U, for example, which is not great. You've got I would say probably the best action RPG, now that I can think about it, that's a survival horror game, is something like State of Decay 2 from Microsoft. Because that's pretty good. That's a solid 7 on the review scale, because it's a fine game. It's okay, but it's not as good as the master classic that is Parasite Eve. That game is amazing. It was an incredible PS1 game. It's a game that I'm hoping more people will finally be able to play when the PlayStation Plus live service comes later this summer, because I know it's a game that a lot of people just didn't play, or there's people like you, Garrett, who didn't have a PS1. So you missed
Nope.
a game like this, right? So I wanted to include Parasite Eve there because again, that's an example of a game that only works super well because it's turn based, and it's awesome. So I wanted to include it here. So Garrett, what do you have to say about my rebuttal with it? But where is your action RPG that's also a survival horror game that you want to combat this with?
Well, it's just that okay, you pulling out a PS1 game, and I mean I've heard of Parasite Eve. I heard it's great.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that where's our Parasite Eve of today? Who's making it? Like I don't know a turn-based horror action or like survival horror game other than that.
There are
You
some
can
in the indie
argue
space, but
that
it's not like you're right, not in like the mainstream AAA space, anyways.
right. I mean, you can argue Dungeon what is it? Darkest Dungeon
Mm-hmm.
is very dark, but it's not like horror, right? It's like not that focused. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of the action horror games you see today is bringing in I feel like a lot of RPG elements in general. I remember playing Evil Within and I'm just like kind of crazy. It's just like, oh, you're getting perks and skills up, and you go to a hub where you're installing needles inside your brain in order to get more stuff, or like different types of powers or whatever. I know it's not like really action RPG, but it is certainly bringing a lot of RPG elements into the survival horror scene now. But yeah, that's my only rebuttal is that I don't know about Parasite Eve. I have not played it, and we just don't see a current one today.
That's true.
Hopefully, I get to play it.
Yeah.
So.
You bring up a good point, and again, I wanted to include that here not just to represent survival horror games, but also the idea that I think you can take like almost any genre of medium, whether it's a horror game or sci-fi game or whatnot, and turn it into like a really good turn-based RPG. And again, like I think Parasite Eve is an example of a game that you would never think of probably in like the turn-based space.
Yeah.
And again, like I think like the most modern example I can think of a game like this is something like Corpse Party, which just recently came to Xbox, which was originally on the PSP, but they ended up doing kind of a remake for it on modern consoles. But that game is like a really cool like Japanese horror game that takes place in like a creepy school, and you're going around basically trying to keep the rest of the students kind of alive. It was actually like a really nice game that was made in I think RPG Maker as well. I think we talked about that a long time ago on a previous episode. But yeah, so I wanted to make sure to include that. And plus, any excuse I have, Garrett, to talk about Parasite Eve on an episode of the show, Garrett, I'm going to take that opportunity. Let's be real.
Sounds great.
But Garrett, what's next for me? What's your next game?
I want to move over back to the Japanese world, the Japan world of action RPGs. I think they've gotten to a point like the past 3 to 4 years where it's very accessible and very open to the general audience, and people are really digging it. The action RPG side of JRPGs. I mean, you see stuff like Scarlet Nexus coming out, of course, Final Fantasy VII Remake, and then Nier Automata. Like these games, I feel like in Astral Chain, they have a style to them, Ryan. That's super neat, super cool. And the moves and the action feels very satisfying. And I think over in Japan, they've really gone down that style recently. And I'm really enjoying myself getting into these action RPGs, especially when I was playing Final Fantasy VII Remake. I should go back to that. Like, I don't know why I stopped because I was just playing something else. And of course, I can only really focus 1 to 2 games at a time. But what I've played of it, it is so good. The music, and then just like getting into the action part of Final Fantasy VII Remake is so good, especially with Cloud. It was very satisfying, and the graphics look as best as they ever done. Right, the past few years, and especially with that PS5 upgrade, and especially being on PC. The style and the smoothness of action RPGs they're just a delight now. I think they're just the most fun they've ever been. And so I think it's going to continue to be like that. It's going to continue to get better in a sense of graphics and style and the action. part of these are kind of the combat system of these games, and I can't wait to see what Japan brings out more of these action RPGs. And I'm certainly can't wait for Square Enix and their was it Valkyrie Elysium coming out later
Yeah.
this year. Of course they can always go back to the Nier series, so there's just a lot of IP that they're kind of drawing from, and there's like, okay, let's put the action RPG spin on it now and see what we can do. So,
although
I
speaking of
wanted to
turn-based
go for it.
RPGs, because you were talking about Valkyrie Elysium, Garrett. Just throwing it out there because this is unrelated, but it's off topic. But I was very excited because Valkyrie Profile Lilith, which is the PSP remake of the original Valkyrie Profile, got trademarked this week for like a remastered version.
Wow.
So
Cool.
I am very excited for that because that's a great turn-based RPG, Garrett. See what I did there? Because Valkyrie Elysium, the new one's an action RPG. Because clearly, I mean, if you were to argue for that, they're like, oh yeah, they saw the error of their ways making that series, turn-based. So we're gonna go in the action RPG direction because that's the better one. But no, I disagree with that because the turn-based games are so much better. But anyways, to kind of give my rebuttal, first of all, Final Fantasy VII Remake, you probably never need to finish it, Garrett, because maybe I would love to hear your opinion of the ending of someone who never played the original one or never finished the original one, I should say, because the ending of that game goes places, and I don't know if I think it's for the better, but we're gonna keep out of that. But you're right. Basically the action RPGs give publishers the ability to take classic games and then kind of reinvent them in a cool way. And definitely, I think they did that with Final Fantasy VII Remake. But I would argue, Garrett, that I think that because the combat was so good in the original Final Fantasy VII, like the first one on the PS1, that I actually think that you actually probably would have had the same effect if they just made that a turn-based remake, but then still gave it all of the graphical, updates that they did with the music, with everything else. And I still think it would have been an amazing game that way. In fact, it might even been a better game because one of the downsides, I think, to that game, and I don't know if you remember this from playing it, Garrett, but and this has kind of become a modern trend in a lot of Japanese action RPGs, is what I refer to as the stagger mechanic that kind of originated in a game like Final Fantasy 13, but has kind of made its way to a lot of other Japanese games where a lot of times on an enemy, you don't do any damage to it, or it's like very minuscule damage until you stagger it or stun it, and then you just go to town on it. And I found like towards the end of that game, like that mechanic just became so annoying with some enemies, especially some of the later game enemies, because even some of the normal enemies you'd fight, you'd just be hacking away at them for like 2 minutes, just pressing the X button to just do your standard attacks until eventually you build up enough ATB gauge to do the specific abilities you need to do in order to stagger them. And then when you stagger them, you kill them very quickly. So it's just like, I felt like that game in particular had some really uneven combat towards the end of the game that just really took me out of the experience. And again, it's not even just an isolated issue with that particular game. I noticed it's been a modern issue with Japanese action RPGs in some cases. Even a game like Scarlet Nexus, I had a bit of that problem, but I think that it was better balanced with that game versus Final Fantasy VII Remake in particular. But that's just my piece with that.
But there you go. Well, I just want to shout out. Those are good argument there. I just want to say Nier Automata, very very smooth action gameplay, and I love the transition between like third person action combat and then straight into like it goes to that top down view and does a shooter type of game going on, and then it quickly pans back in and you're back into third person mode. I think that's super cool. And also Astral Chain with its kind of like the companion chain mechanic where it goes around. So there's a lot of novelties to be had in the action RPG still. And I think it's only just the beginning with these Japanese action RPGs. So there you go.
For sure. Well, now that you brought up, a classic remake, Garrett, I wasn't going to put this one here. I was going to save this one for last, but I feel like this is the perfect segue to throw in here because, I mean, why remake a classic game, Garrett, when you don't have to, when the classic game holds up so well, when your game is Chrono Trigger and you never need to remake it ever because it looks so beautiful and it plays so well. from the turn-based perspective that you never need to remake Chrono Trigger. I mean, we will probably see a remake of it eventually in HD 2D. I'm pretty certain of that at some point. But that's a game you never have to remake because, 20 years from now, it will still be amazing to go back to that game. Whereas, I don't know if you've ever tried to go back to PlayStation 3 era action RPGs, Garrett, but sometimes...
We don't talk about those.
Well, I'm about to, because I'm just saying, using it as a point of comparison, or even like PlayStation 2 era action RPGs, the problem with action RPGs that I find is that in a lot of cases, they age very quickly. Like they're not as timeless as a lot of turn-based RPGs, where like 10 to 20 years from now, Garrett, if we go back then 20 years from now and play Final Fantasy VII Remake on the PlayStation 4 or PlayStation 5, will it really feel as smooth to control versus action RPGs of that era? I don't think so.
I don't know if that's because of time, but anyways, keep on with your argument. I want you to finish your argument first.
Yeah, I mean, with action RPGs in particular, I think the way that they evolve at such a quick rate and such a amazing rate that it quickly outdates action RPGs in a lot of ways. And not only that, but visual design too, with a lot of action RPGs. I just don't find, like, with modern action RPG design, they don't have as much of a timeless look as a lot of, turn-based RPGs, even modern ones. Like a game like Dragon Quest XI S or a game like Persona 5, I feel like is going to age much slower from a visual standpoint, let alone a combat standpoint, than a game like Final Fantasy VII Remake is or Nier Automata is, 10 or 20 years from now, I think, when we look back on these games. Just like in the same way that, action RPGs on the Super Nintendo, when you compare them to, turn-based RPGs on the Super Nintendo, like Chrono Trigger, which is kind of like the peak example of this, like it's really tough to, like I just don't feel like they bond in the same way, or they don't, they don't last the test of time in the same way. So that's why what I wanted to bring up, like a really classic turn-based RPG, because I feel like they stand the test of time from a combat design perspective a lot better than action RPGs are. Sure, there can be some pacing issues with some older turn-based RPGs, and I'm not totally turning a blind eye to that, but most of the modern masterpieces of that era play a lot better today versus the masterpieces in the action RPG era of that era, I should say, of the Super Nintendo era, like the Tales of Destiny or something like that. But Garrett, what do you think about my point about that?
No, I mean, you bring up a valid point on the aging of action RPGs, especially a good portion of them in the PS2, PS3 days. I totally agree with you that it's harder to get back into that genre, especially in those previous gen consoles. I think the aging, though, especially just from like a graphics and a frames perspective, I mean, you can go up to 4K, I guess, and 120 or even faster than 120. Sure, you can go as high as you want by then, because the human eye is not going to really tell the difference between the motion. I think we've gotten to the point where it's not going to feel as dated in a sense of graphics and motion. I can agree with you probably in terms of mechanics. I'm sure people are going to refine the action RPG combat 10, 20, 30 years from now. But you know what? There is definitely some action RPGs that are still they're still really playable today. Like I played Dragon Age, was it Origins?
Yeah.
Like in 2019. Even though the graphics wasn't that great, but and the action RPG was still there, and I still had a really good time with it. I'm sure there's other examples out there. I just want to say, yeah, a good portion of them, I can agree with you, pretty dated, but not all of them.
Yeah. I mean, take that example and then compare it to going back and playing Mass Effect 1 on the Xbox 360, Garrett, because that's a rough experience. Because the story is amazing, but the combat is a rough experience if you go back to it.
So, yeah, that's kind of true.
Yeah. Also, Dragon Age, depending on what console you play on, because if you play on PC, that's pretty much just a turn-based RPG in a lot of ways anyway. So
oh, that's true.
It also kind of works out that way. But Garrett, give me your final game, because it's time to give me your final argument for action RPGs.
I think we've gotten to the point of like kind of this consolidation between like an action game with RPG elements in it, and it's so hard to blend between the two. And I think that's why it brings a lot of general audience here. But I want to bring out a recent game that just came out this year that's kind of shaking the gaming world and the non-gaming world. And like that company is going places. I don't know what it's doing, but it has a huge fan base. I am talking about the Soulsborne series, Dark Souls and Elden Ring. I don't know what they're doing over there, but they just created like some type of genre back in the Demon Soul days, and they just kept at it from then on out. I don't know, like I don't know what you think, Ryan, but they kind of just staggered the RPG genre and created its own genre itself. Inspired so many people, especially with Elden Ring being the best it's like arguably a lot of people are saying it's the best it's ever been in terms of the action combat. Of course it's brutal, of course it can be hard, but I think it captured a lot of gamers' minds in terms of just how to approach opponent and like how to find its weak points. And I played Bloodborne earlier this year, a good portion of it, and I kind of understand where people are coming from. There is a kind of a pacing to these games. It's like you get into there and kind of figure out what the area is, and then it's like peeling an onion. It's like there's a layer after layer. And of course, you played Elden Ring. You understand that you're going out into the open world of Elden Ring, and it's just so deep, and it goes to places. And I think that our action combat really lends itself in there. It's seamless, it's open, it's explorative, and I think a lot of gamers are really enamored by it. So yeah, I think the heaviest hitter ever for the action RPG genre is the Soulsborne series, and any games that follow there, because it's a huge following now, and especially with Elden Ring being so successful.
Yeah.
But yeah,
That makes perfect sense, and I mean that's a good genre to bring up because it really basically takes the tenets of older, really difficult games, like Ninja Gaiden or Devil May Cry, but takes them to like a whole different level and really like adds those RPG elements to make them like their own kind of unique experience. Or it kind of reminds me in a lot of ways of like a 3D version of what you would get out of like the Castlevania Game Boy Advance games or the DS games, where they're like action RPGs where you play as one of the Castlevania characters, and you're going around like killing all kinds of like grotesque enemies, and it's they can have like this like kind of like high difficulty to them, like that's kind of like the 2D representation of what I would think of like a Soulsborne game would be. So it's interesting that you bring those up, because I definitely think of like the modern games and what's hot right now as far as RPGs are concerned. I mean, yeah, you're definitely right on the money with that, and it's hard to argue against that. And I think that it's a really big genre when you look at modern action RPGs. So yeah, unfortunately, it's like it's really tough to do kind of like a turn-based Soulsborne game, because that doesn't really exist, and it's really kind of impossible to kind of translate that experience well. But I mean, you can still have high difficulty, turn-based games, but it's just unfortunately that's really not a good.
That's a niche genre, though. Unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah, which is too bad. Well, Garrett, as for me, I just like you brought in another genre to kind of that has really evolved from action RPGs. I had to bring in a similar genre from action RPGs as well, and I know it's one that you and I both love, and that is strategy RPGs. Because if there's one type of RPG that does not work action-based, Garrett, it's strategy RPGs do not really work. You can have like real-time strategy RPGs, but like they don't really work super well. Like I know we've got that Diodode Chronicle, I think it's called, that's coming out later this year.
Diafield Chronicle.
The Diafield Chronicle. Thank you, Garrett.
Yeah.
That one's coming out later this year. That one's more of so like a turn. That one's like a weird mix of real-time strategy and turn-based, kind of like something like Tactics Ogre is. But like the only other RPG series that's an action RPG that I can think of that's also a a strategy RPG is the Kingdom Islander Fire series. Garrett, I don't know if you're familiar with that series, but essentially that series, first of all, they're actually on Steam now if you want to ever go play them. But they basically give you this like isometric top-down view of a battlefield, and you're basically playing it like a real-time strategy game, like StarCraft. But then as your enemies run up to each other, the camera then shifts down to the battlefield where all the units are. Yeah. You take control of one of the units, and it becomes an action RPG with that unit, where you're killing the enemies. And it's like a really unique twist. But man, those games are not very good. They have like their own cult following, but they're not great. Especially when you compare them to games like Fire Emblem, Shining Force, Disgaea, like all of the other strategy RPGs that are out there, like Triangle Strategy, like most recently, like it's just, there's no contest between the two of them. It's turn-based games that work in the strategy department. And strategy RPGs, even though they haven't been around as long as traditional RPGs, because we talked about it on a few episodes back, how kind of strategy RPGs kind of originated in the early 90s. Like, it's a genre that is so fun, especially if you like RPGs and strategy games. Like, if it blends those two so well together that, like, that's a huge leg up if you want like a strategic RPG experience. Like, there's only one way to go, baby, and it's turn-based RPGs, Garrett. So what's your rebuttal to that?
I love strategy RPGs.
I knew it.
That's my rebuttal. No, I really like them. I like, you can say negative things or negative aspects about like the pacing or, you know, difficulty or whatever. And it's like, yeah, but that's not because it's a strategy RPG though. Like, strategy RPG can be perfected and really, like, it can be balanced. It can be unbalanced in certain regards. If you know, but I really enjoy going through and figuring out. I don't think it's for everyone. I don't think like I would go to a random person and be like, you're gonna love strategy RPGs. Here you go. Here's a Fire Emblem game, and they're gonna be like, what? Like, no, I wanna like just hack and slash stuff. Like, I wanna, you know, produce just combos like right then and there. I think that's the one thing that deters a lot of people from just turn-based games in general. Is just it's not like, the pacing is just not there for them. It's like they want to get into it just to get into it and then get out. So I love strategy RPGs though. You don't get me wrong. But that's just what I think of it.
Makes sense. I mean, yeah. I knew, you know, playing to my opponent's strengths here, that's one that I knew you couldn't ignore anyways, is strategy RPGs, because we both really love strategy RPGs actually. But
yes, we do.
It's just like, again, there are certain genres that work really well in action RPGs that don't work as turn-based games, and vice versa as well, which is kind of cool to see. So, I think we should kind of wrap up this conversation before we go. Actually, let's let the listeners in first before we kind of, you know, try and actually pick a winner between the two of these, Garrett. Because we, of course, out of any good debate, Garrett, we have to actually pick a winner, of course. So
of
course, we got these from Discord, and we've actually gotten a lot of questions since Carpool Gaming Days. And huge thank you to everyone who's been asking us about this as well. How do they submit questions to the shows? So I'm going to go over it again. So if you'd like to be part of the show, there's a number of awesome ways to do that. Number one, if you follow us on Twitter at Carpool Gaming on Twitter, we put up a question post every single, basically afternoon before the show posts, usually that day. Or if it's something like the Nintendo Drive that films in the morning, they'll usually do it like the night before, essentially. But just if you leave your question on the question post, we'll be able to answer it on the show. Or if you join the Carpool Gaming Discord, which there's a link to it in the show notes or the description of this video if you're watching on YouTube, and you join our awesome Discord, basically we put up a question post there as well, and you can actually let us know your question there. Or likewise, if you have a question and I haven't put up a question post yet, all you have to do is go to the RPG Cave section, type in your question, tag me at Ryan Turford on the Discord server, and then I will make sure your question gets part of the show, just like Marcus O'Neill 79 did on the Discordia. And he says, turn-based all the way for me. As someone who likes to be able to take my time strategizing my attacks, even though I do love certain action RPGs like The Witcher, I find that for me, many just end up devolving into mashing the attack buttons and not fully exploring all my combat options. And that was something I tried to bring up at least a little bit, where that is definitely a common problem with some action RPGs, where a lot of times you really are just pressing the attack button over and over again, almost closer to
That's
something
true.
like a Dynasty Warriors kind of game, which is kind of a
That's
turnoff
true.
for me, and certainly a turnoff sounds like it for Marcus O'Neill as well, Garrett.
Marcus O'Neill played Nobody Saves the World. It's not just a mash. Let me tell you, it's so good. Anyways, you can keep on going.
That's the exception to the rule, Garrett. Next up, we got Awesome Dave 1337 who says, as someone who likes to strategize and plan ahead, I also prefer turn-based RPGs. It's also what I grew up with, and I have a strong nostalgia for turn-based systems. So thank you once again, Awesome Dave. See, 2 people are in my corner so far, Garrett. Will the action RPG people come in? Only time will tell. Well, next up, the Muffin One, aka Kevin Ainsworth, over on the Project X Talk podcast, says, this is such a hard choice. My favorite JRPG series is the Tales of series, which is an action RPG. But overall, I think I have to say I'm # team turn-based. A bad combat system can really hurt an action RPG, and in my opinion, story is the most important part of a role-playing game, so choosing turn-based, which is probably the safer option, lets the focus be on the story like it should be. Like, all good points.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, the Tales of series, I have to agree with them, one of the best action RPG series, but yeah, like it can kind of be intermittent and yeah, like the focus on the story, like a game like Skyrim, for example, Garrett, you have to at least agree with me on this one. Like, how good is the story really in a game like Skyrim?
You don't go there for the story, man. You go there for literally everything else.
But that's just playing into Kevin's point here. And I kind of agree with him at least a little bit on this one. Because especially with like open world action RPGs, I find that that's a common problem with them, where the story is kind of like the adventure you make along the way, which works for some
garnish,
people. But,
basically, yeah.
But like, I don't think that works for everybody. So,
yeah.
Throwing that out there.
I agree with you.
Next up, Nagachaka says, prior to Final Fantasy VII Remake, I would have said turn-based all the way. However, I find the combat in Final Fantasy VII Remake to be incredibly deep, challenging, but also very rewarding at the same time. So, to all the points you made earlier, Nagachaka's in your corner, Garrett.
Oh, well, thank you, Nagachaka. I agree with you. I love the action of it, of what I've played of it. I need to get back into it, but yeah, totally agree with you there.
Yeah.
It's so good.
Last comment about this topic comes to us from TPR on Discord, who says, from my previous questions, this should come as no shock. I am an action RPG guy. The slow pace of turn-based RPGs bore me. I don't like spending several minutes thinking of my next move in games. It's been a tough pill to swallow, but one I've come to terms with. And he also has a follow-up question as well. Do you guys have any turn-based RPGs you still recommend for someone like myself? So again, this is TPR is someone who gets bored very quickly of turn-based RPGs. So is there one we really recommend to him as far as pacing are concerned? Because I think this is a tough one to kind of recommend.
This is a tough one. What I recommend, TPR, actually, is try out like probably like shorter type of turn-based games. You can think of like indie type of games. The ones that pop to my mind is Child of Light and Transistor. I think they're just like more chewable type of turn-based games, especially Transistor. It's like kind of a mix between both, because you can have like the action sequence like throughout like the battlefield, but you can also stop and then strategize and go through like a different set of series of steps to finish a battle. But yeah, I think of like try to do a more of a shorter term or short turn-based games, indie games. I'm thinking like SteamWorld. What was it? The SteamWorld Quest is another good one as well. What do you think, Ryan?
Yeah, honestly, I think you hit the nail on the head with that one, because I think, see, the problem is like with this is TPR inherently talks about the design being kind of a problem for him, regardless of what direction we go with it, because he mentions he doesn't like the idea of strategizing his moves like at all.
Yeah.
And that's like without, there's at least some level of strategy regardless of what turn-based RPG we tell him to play.
Right.
But I think like recommending an indie game, like a smaller, more bite-sized experience, is certainly on the right track for sure. And the other two I'll throw out there are Cosmic Star Heroine, which I think actually does like a really good job of getting you through combat really quickly. And then a game like Undertale It's also like a really
Undertale's
good,
good too.
like turn-based RPG. You can argue it has some action elements because you are kind of, sometimes you have the bullet hell sections where you have to like, move the heart around to kind of avoid some of the attacks.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like a nice fusion between action RPGs and turn-based RPGs. So that out of all these, I think that might actually be like the best place to start. Or even a game like Deltarune from the same developer, even if you've maybe tried Undertale before, maybe try something like that. Because it's also the only game that we talked about here where you can flirt with the enemies, Garrett, to try and, stop them from hitting you in the face. So there you go.
I mean, there's Shin Megami Tensei 5. You try to flirt with them. So.
That's true. You're not wrong about that. But yeah, so now we have to crown a winner. So the community results, Garrett, 3-2 in favor of turn-based RPGs. Which actually surprises me. I think I didn't think it was going to be that evenly split, but what do you think,
me
Garrett?
too.
If you had to speak from the heart of heart, Garrett's heart of heart, which do you personally prefer?
Yeah. From the personal heart of hearts, I don't know if there's a winner per se. I think there's a winner for a certain group of people and then another group of people. Man, like I just think the turn-based games is such a classic, and it brings in a lot of people realizing these stories that turn-based RPGs like actually tell, and they've been so versatile too. I think action RPGs, as you said, it can get dated for previous console generations, but I think they're on the rise right now. There's a lot of fluff in like the action game space right now, but I think the developers are really focusing and just only getting better and better with action RPGs. So, but man, the games list that you put out for now, this is just a personal thing for me. It's the turn-based RPGs because, gosh, I'm just loving I'm a strategy person too, so it's more of a I'm betraying the action RPGs, but I wanted to highlight some of the good stuff that's in action RPGs, and especially the current ones going on, especially Elden Ring, man, like being such a shakeup to the gaming world. It's like getting non-gamers into into games too. I'm just like, this is crazy. It's like the Bethesda wave too, with Skyrim and Fallout 3. I got non-gamers in, and I'm like, man, I don't know if I'm sure turn-based, one or two turn-based RPGs have done that. Final Fantasy VII has done that.
Yeah.
Back in the day, but man, I don't know now. I'm not too sure.
I think the closest example between that is like Persona 5 or something like that. But even then, it's like that's still a very niche game. It's not selling 12 million copies like Elden Ring is. So,
right. Yeah,
for sure. You make up some good points. But yeah, like I'm with you. I think we're both actually very similar when it comes to this character because I'm also a very strategic person. So, I mean, I just I'm more in the camp of playing, strategic like experiences. So I'm going to just obviously lean towards turn-based games. It's not even just because I grew up with them, but it's just like, I personally just like the strategy element that comes along with them.
Me too.
Because I like strategy games. So it's just like, it makes sense for me to be kind of more in that camp. So it's official then. Our official ruling is turn-based RPGs win by a hair. But to your point,
by a hair.
No matter who wins, we all win as gamers because there's a lot of great choices out there. I think you brought up a lot of great games on the action RPG side as well. And I think that, there's a lot of great games down that rabbit hole as well. And yeah, regardless of what type of RPGs that you like, I mean, they're still RPGs and they're still awesome. So definitely check out what you want to play. But last question before we go, because Garrett, we actually had a question from the community that had literally nothing to do with tonight's topic. And that comes to us from Brian Eck on the Discord, who asks us, this is going to be a good episode and a great talking point. As a kid, I was so intimidated by the RPG genre, but now as a 36-year-old adult, I've gotten back into gaming and I really appreciate the genre. Chrono Trigger really did it for me last year. My question for you guys is, though, what is the game that got you into RPGs? So, Garrett, we talked about this on the very first episode of the RPG Cave, because, in fact, the name of that title is called How We Got into RPGs, essentially. But for any new listeners, because I know that we actually have a lot of new listeners, Garrett, who might not have gone back and, listened to all the old episodes. Cool. I feel it's okay for us, because we're almost at 50 episodes, Garrett. It's probably good for us to tell the story again.
That's crazy.
So again, regale me of the tale once again on how you got into RPGs. And what was
sure. I mean, I got into video games basically because of Pokemon. That was kind of like the first video game I really gotten into in the genre, and I didn't know what an RPG like genre was at the time. I was just a little kid, and I don't think I would define myself was really into that genre basically until like Skyrim came out around 2011. I think once I got into Skyrim and the Bethesda hit, I understood what that genre meant in terms of just like leveling up and like progressing your character and then like going on quests and being exploration first. That's the focus in my mind. Is like you just go out in the go out there in the world and interact. And then I just realized, oh, Pokemon's the same thing, kind of in a way. You're progressing your party of monsters, and like I didn't know there was a whole genre about this, and that's when I really got into a lot of more RPGs and got more open into that genre. And then lastly, I would say Persona 4 Golden, once I got that on Vita and started playing that more, I realized there's a lot of cool turn-based RPGs that was outside of the Pokemon realm as well. So those are kind of the main pillars of my RPGs that really got me into the gaming space and the RPGs. What about you, Ryan?
So for me, and this is a very silly story that I told on the very first episode, but it's impossible for me to answer this question without saying it. So back in the day, of course, back when before the internet existed, back in the late 80s, basically we were going to go rent video games from our local video store. So first off, before I go into this real quick, the game I'm about to talk to was not my first RPG I ever played. The very first RPG I ever played was the original Final Fantasy. I played it at my cousin's house. Had no idea it was an RPG. Didn't really get into it, the RPG genre from that. So that doesn't count from this question, but I wanted to add that for preference here. But going back to my story, we were looking for a game to rent one weekend, and we went to a rental store in our neighborhood, and there was only one game on the shelf, which was Genghis Khan for the NES. Now, Genghis Khan on the NES, not actually an RPG at all. In fact, it's actually a like Romance of the Three Kingdoms style strategy game, essentially.
Nice.
So it's like, obviously, that's a very, acquired taste, essentially. And, those games are not really my type of thing, even nowadays. But we decided, we'll take a chance on this game, see what it is, because there's no other games here, and we really wanted to rent something because we were dead set on them. My dad was like, are you really sure you want to rent this? Because, it doesn't sound that great. But we were like, no, let's do it. So we took the game home, played it for 5 minutes, and we were like, what the heck is this? Especially because when you would rent a game back in the day, especially a lot of times from a mom and pop stop, which is what this place we rented it from, we didn't have the manual. So it's like referencing a lot of things in the manual as far as, basically giving you references on what to do in the game, but we didn't have the manual. We had no idea what to do with the games and let alone how to play it. So we ended up actually returning the game to the store that day and and we decided to ask, the video rental store guy, like, hey, what kind of game is this so we know to stay away from this game in the future? And he told us it was an RPG. So we just assumed, okay, that's an RPG. We need to stay away from all RPGs forever now because of Genghis Khan on the NES, essentially. But
oh my goodness.
So all these years later, I went years and years without playing RPGs until there was actually a service that some people might be familiar with, old people like me anyways will remember this, called the Sega Channel, which was essentially a subscription service that Sega did through your cable company, like through Turner Cable or a bunch of different cable companies, where essentially you'd sign up for the monthly service and pay a monthly fee, and they would give you a special Genesis cart that basically had like your coax cable, screwed into it. And it would allow you it would allow you to download games from a service that it basically made like certain like ROMs available to you every single month that you basically would download, and they would rotate in and out every single month. So we actually went in there and we were scouring through the games that were on Sega Channel, because I think throughout that time we played almost every game that was on Sega Channel going forward. But the game we ran into that really got me into RPGs was Shining Force 2 on the Sega Genesis, because we happened to, try it out because it was on this, game rental service, essentially, that just happened to be there. But it was like, oh, this sounds cool. It's got, Wizards and Warriors in the description. That sounds cool. We'll download it. So, and of course, when you download something on Sega Channel, it takes like 10 minutes just to download the, 1 or 2 megs of data that ROM actually ends up being through your cable line, in 1994. But we ended up playing that game to death, and then I found out later through a magazine that was in fact an RPG. So I was like, oh, RPGs can actually be cool. So that was the game that really got me into RPGs and really like showed me that RPGs were a genre worth pursuing. And Shining Force 2 is actually one of my favorite, strategy role-playing games of all time, made by Camelot. Of course, who made Golden Sun and the Mario sports games, but man, that was a good time. And yeah, that's my story on how I got into RPGs. Was, I had a really bad experience one time, but it was really Shining Force 2 that kind of turned that around for me. So that's how I got into RPGs.
Wow. Okay, so the coaxial cable was to the console or to the
cartridge? The cartridge had like an actual coax slot on the side of it that you just screw it in on.
Oh, you just screw it in. Oh my goodness, that's insane.
Yeah,
I did not realize that.
They're pretty amazing.
That's some old school stuff, man. Wow.
The crazy thing with Sega Channel as well, Garrett, because first of all, it was so ahead of its time. It was essentially Game Pass, but in 1994. But the craziest thing about it, where there were games exclusive in North America to Sega Channel. So the only way you could play them is if you had a subscription to Sega Channel. Kind of like, actually very similar to, the Radical Dreamers thing that we talked about with Chrono Cross, how that was on Satellaview and you had to be subscribed to Satellaview to play it. Same deal with some of these games like Mega Man The Wily Wars, which was a remake of Mega Man 1, 2, and 3 from the NES on the Sega Genesis. The only way you could play that game in North America was on Sega Channel. So
that's crazy.
You had to have this subscription. It was really goofy, and they did that with a lot of games that were exclusive to it. But there you go. That's my old man history lesson about Sega Channel for the day. I mean, actually, one of my first episodes, because we announced we're doing a new video game history series that I'll be recording kind of every single week called Project Pit Stop Gaming History. The title, Garrett, of course, in honor of Project Triangle Strategy or Project Octopath Traveler, is one of the episodes we're going to do is about Sega Channel. So I'll be talking about that more there and in more in depth and kind of some of the funny things about Sega Channel. But there you go. We should probably wrap up the show though, Garrett, because we're like an hour and 20 minutes in. We should probably get going. But before we go, Garrett, plugs go.
You can follow me on Twitter at Blind Explosion. You can also see me on the Nintendo Shack, part of the Play Some Video Games podcast network. We're live on Thursdays, 9:30 Eastern Time, 6:30 Pacific, and released on podcast services like Spotify, Apple, Google. There's Amazon too. The other things too, released around the world. And yeah, that's pretty much it, man.
Very nice, my friend. As for me, you can find me on Twitter at Ryan Turford. You can find us on Twitter at Carpool Gaming, on YouTube at youtube.com/Carpool Gaming, and on podcast services around the globe. So, for Garrett Bland, I'm Ryan Turford. This has been the 44th level of the RPG Cave, and we're out.
Bye-bye.